What's up? Do you feel like you're free? Do you think you're in control of your actions? Or does it sometimes feel like, nature, instincts, or, the world around you dictates what you do? Well, look, today we're going to talk about, do we have free will? This is the Existential Stoic Podcast. I'm Danny, everybody. Randy, what's up, Randy?
Here, Danny.
So, Randy, have you ever, thought about the issue of freedom and free will and whether we have it?
This is a crazy one. I think about it a lot because there's no way to tell. It's one of those you don't know. And even if
No.
we have free will, like there's that quote that I sent you that's like, of course we have free will, except for the choice to have free will. And
Well,
it's
that's
like,
like, yeah.
yeah,
The existentialists, Sartre famously said that, right? We're condemned to be free. So, like, the only thing we don't have a free choice on is the free will itself, right? Like the ability to exercise free choice. That's the existentialist. And, it's interesting because philosophers have debated this forever, and come up with a lot of different solutions. And it's really interesting because I think about it a lot. Like, you know, Kant said, and I think it's in Groundwork where he said, we can't act except under the idea of freedom, right? Like we have to think we're free in order to act in the world. Because if you think about it, right? Like if we didn't think we were free, our concepts of responsibility, of, of blame, of just taking any sort of ownership for who we are would be out the window. Like if I really thought everything came down to my instincts, to my drives, to my biological makeup, and to the environment, you know, would I really feel like it was me doing anything? And it's this weird situation of like I was just thinking about this last night that our consciousness, we're self-aware and we have the mind body, and it's almost like trying to connect the mind and body together, the physical and the mental. And so we think we're free, but it's not clear that we actually are.
that's really interesting that you mentioned that because it's kind of like touching on the thing of the attribution bias that I was mentioning a little while ago, where like we think when we do something crazy, we think it's because of the external influence, but when somebody else
Yeah.
does it, we think it's a character flaw. And it's
Yeah.
like, so it's like, they have no free will over it, but or no, we have no, I don't know how it works. But anyways, yeah, we're a victim of whatever happens, but they're just a messed up person.
Yeah, we do that all the time, right? Because that's the other thing that's funny is we use our interpretation of free will as a way to, justify or explain away things that we don't like about ourselves too, right? Like, oh, well, I didn't mean to do that. It was the circumstance or this or that. But then, like you said, somebody else does it and you blame them for being that type of person. And
Hmm.
it's really interesting. It's funny. I always like whenever I talk about this, I always tell my class, like, think about like just, stupid things like getting dressed like in the morning, right? We all think like we get up, we put on clothes, we make a choice about what we're wearing. But if you really think about all the factors that probably played into that, like the weather, the laundry that you did or didn't do, the clothes you have on hand, what you're doing that day, who you might be seeing, all these things contribute to those choices. And so is it really freedom or is it all these other things?
I don't know, man. I think I would prefer to not have free will and just and actually know it, because then I could just be like, well, that's just life. Like Marcus
Yeah.
Aurelius talks about a lot in the meditations where he's like, you know, even though it'd be nice to lay in bed all day, we have to get up and do stuff because it's our nature to have the life of a human, which endures
Yeah.
pain, suffering, insufferable people, all these different obstacles that we have to do, but that's like part of our nature. And so it's just like for me, when I think about not having free will, I'm like, well, of course I have these troubles. That makes sense. It's not like I had a choice about it. But then when I think I have free
Yeah.
will, it's like, oh, I have free will and I'm doing all this stuff and stuff still isn't working out. What's going on? Why is it broken?
Well, that's the problem too. I think it does give us the illusion that we have way more control than we really do over the consequences of our actions, right? And what we do in the world. And I think that's a good point that you make too, like where we feel like, like, well, I really put in the effort. Why am I not getting this thing? Even though that getting whatever you're trying to get might depend on a lot of other things outside of your control. It's funny too that you brought that up with Marcus Aurelius, because right, like you could lay in bed all day, but eventually, right, you're gonna have to go to the bathroom, you're gonna have to eat. Like these biological impulses are gonna force you to get up at some point, or you're gonna, have other problems to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And So, but like either way, whether we have free will or whether we don't have free will, it really doesn't matter. It's kind of like I remember, I think it was Henry Ford who people quote as saying like whether you think you can or you think you can't, either way you're right. So it's
Yeah.
like whether you think you have free will or you think you don't have free will, either way you can be right. Like you could have both at the same time. You could have free will and not have free will simultaneously, but there's no way you could ever tell.
Yeah, you couldn't. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's the funny thing about life, right? We debate all these things, but at the end of the day, it really doesn't make a difference because this is what we have.
Mm-hmm.
This is it, like it or not. Well, it's funny.
Mm-hmm.
There's this philosopher, there's a branch of philosophy in the free will area called compatibilism, and they try to make an argument that free will and determinism, causal determinism, are compatible, right? And I think it was Voss von Frazen was his name. He made this argument. He gave an example that I always liked, but he said, imagine like, you had a choice between two actions, just call them A and B. But unbeknownst to you, there's a chip in your brain that somebody put in your brain, and it'll make you choose B if you choose A. So if you were to choose A, you would choose B because this chip's going to override your choice. But you choose B. So the chip doesn't do anything. And so in that case, you're determined to do B because you couldn't do otherwise, but you did choose it. So is that freedom and determinism coinciding,
Dude, that makes me think of these people who have like the two halves of the brain separated. There are a couple people, there's some disease, I think, where it separate the connections, I think the corpus callosum or whatever it is, the connections between the brain are missing. And so their brain doesn't communicate. So you can basically give these people an
Uh,
instruction, but they don't consciously know that they've received that instruction. So like I could say to you like go drink that can of soda, and they would just go do it. But then you'd say, why'd you go drink that can of soda? And they have no recollection of you telling them to go do it. But
that's
their
weird.
brain will make up a whole story about it. They'll be
Yeah.
like, well, I was just walking by and it was sitting there and it looked so delicious. And so I thought to myself, why not? It's here. And so,
Yeah.
but like if your brain isn't connected, all of a sudden you have free will and not free will because you're not free will because you're getting these commands and just doing them, and then you have free will because you can just make up the story about it.
Yeah, isn't that funny that we're also like we are meaning-making beings, so we want to explain the world in a way in which we are agents, right? We're the like kind of star of our show and we're doing things. And it's kind of funny too because I think part of it too is I think, we want to feel responsible for our achievements, right? Like we want to look back and be like, yeah, I did that. That was good. I put in the work. I put in the effort. We don't want to, say like, well, it was just circumstance. I was lucky. I happened to be in the right place at the right time. We want to give all the credit to ourselves and tell these stories. So even in a situation like that, you got to explain it somehow, right? And we always explain it from the standpoint of us being agents in the world doing something, which I find interesting too. Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
it's a really tough question. I always liked Nietzsche had that he was a fatalist. So he thought, there really wasn't free will, but the way he kind of talks about, which is interesting because he's, believes in authenticity and all, but he thought acting authentically was choosing the things that essentially you would otherwise do that align with your nature. So you're never acting contrary to who you are. It's almost like acting instinctually, essentially, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
doing exactly what aligns with who you are. So those choices are almost not like choices. They're what you would have done anyway in all circumstances. And I always like that idea because it's like it really like kind of takes into account, I guess, all these various factors and instead says, look, it's not about free will, it's about aligning yourself with all these things that make you who you are and acting that way in the world, right? Being that person,
Mm-hmm.
such that you can have done otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, you know how in meditation sometimes something will happen and then you'll be able to trace back like how it happened. Like you'll be meditating and all of a sudden you'll get up and then you'll be like, wait, why did I just get up? I was meditating. And then you'll be like, oh yeah, I like smelt food and then I thought I'm hungry and then I'm like, yeah, this meditating is really boring. And then I just get up and it's like all that stuff. So it's like maybe if you're very conscious, you might have some free will because then you could be like, oh, there's a pleasant aroma. And all of a sudden there's free will. Do I want to stop meditating and go do that? Or maybe you don't have free will if you're not really present because it just, you smell something and it just starts this whole chain reaction.
Well, that's the other thing that's interesting too, right? Is that you know, whether we have free will or not, we kind of like the way our society is structured, I guess, with all the things we do, we're very short-term gratification oriented. And, like that kind of thing, right? Where like you smell something nice, you just go over there, right? It's like we're just being led around by our noses essentially. And I think, I wonder sometimes if that's also the problem. Like, think of all the advertising we endure every day trying to convince us to do certain things, all the external pressures, all these things around us that are trying to get us to kind of go a certain way to benefit other people. How much of that is really our own, our own choices for real, not, the ideas from somebody else coming in and kind of infiltrating and taking over.
I would say not very much.
Yeah, right. I mean, think about how much like if you think about it, they're really like how much of who we are and what we do is a consequence of ideas and values we don't come up with our own, but we pick up from external fact sources, And it's like you really get down to it, probably not a lot of the things we do are our own at all. Kind
Mm-mm,
of amazing.
not at all. I know. I'm reading. I just read a couple books on like advertising. One's called cash advertising, the other's called hypnotic writing. And dude, like all the stuff that they do in this copywriting
Oh
is
yeah.
just meant to like totally just guide you by the hand into buying stuff.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's the whole point. Like I always liked Epicurus had the nice way of saying like, we have natural and artificial desires. And the artificial ones are desires that are created basically from like society, from social pressures. Advertising is a good example, right? It's making you think you need something that you didn't need or didn't know about like before, right? That's not necessary for your survival. So natural desires in contrast are like eating, drinking, like a need for like, social relationships or, stuff like that that's like good for a human life. And if you really think most of our life is probably just dictated by those unnecessary artificial desires. It's
Mm-hmm.
crazy. Like,
Absolutely.
if you really think about it, like, why do you use Windows or Mac? Like, what was the initial thing that caused you? Now, it might just be that, your parents had originally purchased one or the other and you got comfortable with it, and that's that.
Or maybe you want to think differently. So, you're
Yeah.
using a
Remember
Mac.
those?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Or you want to be the artist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The cool guy in the coffee shop.
Yeah, I always like those commercials. They have their laptop, they have their Apple phone, their tablet, everything out,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're doing nothing. They're scrolling social media.
Well, that's what most people are doing on their computers all day, every day.
Absolutely.
So free will. I don't
But
know.
this
I
what
I
was
personally I
okay.
personally think that we don't really have much free will. To a limited extent, we can have a little bit, but like my whole thing is if we have free will, don't die or stop thinking. Like if you had free will, go ahead and do either of those things. But it's like, nah, can't really do that. So maybe those are extreme examples, but it's like even like all the stuff that I do that I think is my free will, my choice, how do I actually know that that's me choosing it and I haven't been influenced to do it?
Well, that's the hard part too, right? And I think this is where I like there's one thing that I've always liked about existentialism too, which is the emphasis on really getting clear about like your values, what matters to you, and the choices you make, and really trying to get down to like that they are from you, whether they're aligning with, just your nature or like your biological makeup, whatever, or like, but they're not from external sources. You're not letting outside influence dictate you. But like, we live in society. I mean, we live in a world where we're constantly bombarded with stuff from the outside influencing us. It's really hard. And it's hard to know, like you said, like even like, doing what we're doing, like, change, like taking on a career, or doing something. Like, how do you know that really it was your choice? Like, and if it's like, if it was influenced by like your talent or something, does that still really count as choice, or is that just like you're already primed for it? It's really hard to know.
Well, yeah, like what you were talking about, the snowboarding guy who
Yeah.
like didn't grow up in a cold climate. Or like how about the professional snowboarders that grew up in a cold climate? Did they actually choose to become professional snowboarders, or was it just happenstance and circumstance and all that stuff? And that's
Yeah,
what
they got
they
lucky, right? You got lucky.
ended
You
up.
happened to grow up in a place where that was easily accessible and you had some skills for it. So look what happens, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
most people that do something really well, it's something they already had kind of an affinity for,
Yeah.
usually in a natural gift.
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing because like it kind of almost touches on that concept of luck, where like you're like some people are lucky they were at the right place at the right time, and Abraham Lincoln gets attributed with this quote, "The harder I work, the luckier I get," and I think there is some like
Oh yeah.
there's just some truth to that because if you're putting in the work at the right place at the right time, eventually it'll strike and you'll get lucky. But it's like without putting in the work, you're not going to get that. But it's not guaranteed that if you put in the work, you're going to get the stuff.
No, but it's interesting too though because like I always like that quote too though because it's like if you do put in the work though, just in virtue of putting in the work, you create new opportunities that then become potentially lucky, essentially lucky moments, right? Like I can't, you know, I can think and dream about a different career all I want, but I'll never have the opportunity until I actually start making the effort to, transition, learn those things and do those things, right? And I think
Yeah.
like once we do, we start making those opportunities possible. It's like you do create your own luck in that sense, right?
Yeah. Or even like I get a kick out of the people who like, they'll always say like, "Oh, well maybe I'll win the lottery." And I always ask, I'm like, "Did you buy a ticket?" And they're like, "No."
No,
And I'm like, "So you're looking for the exceptionally lucky chance where you stumble upon a winning ticket that somebody else let go
dropped
and you win. Like not just the infinitesimal chance of buying a ticket and winning, but like stumbling upon a winning
the
ticket. Like
winning
that
ticket that fell on the ground.
I
Yeah,
know.
when the chances of that ticket of winning are already like what, 1 in 300 trillion or something ridiculous,
Yeah.
like yeah,
Crazy.
it's amazing. Yeah, it is
Uh-huh.
funny. It's really strange though, because I think about this a lot because we really do like, you know, I mean, we think of ourselves as free. I think most of us do, right? Like we think of our actions as our own. And I always wondered too if that's like if it's not really about freedom, but like a consequence of like adaptation with consciousness that, like you're not to sound weird, but like, your brain's driving the body, right?
Hmm.
So it's like that, you want to have, you want to feel responsible. It enables us to live socially and take responsibility for things, blame people, allows us to, point out things that were wrong and then find somebody that's a culprit, even though arguably, like, you know, look at anybody in jail. Most people, you could probably trace back a line and show that, like, most of their actions probably really weren't, their own. They were on a course already from an early age
Hmm.
or something.
Hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Interesting that you mentioned that. It kind of touches on what we were talking about last week with are we living in a simulation? Because we can't prove we're not. And like, so this whole concept, like, what if we are just lines of code that some programmer, just
Yeah.
random stuff that each person gets, and that's just how we end up living out our life?
Not to digress into something totally insane, but I was thinking about this last night right before I fell asleep. But I was reading an article about a new quasar they found that's like, and you know how those like they spin at a certain rate? And for some reason, I don't know why last night, but I was thinking about like that's just like the mechanism in a computer, right? The clock that
Yeah.
keeps the hertz going so that everything's at the right speed. And I was like, that's kind of interesting. Like you have all these like natural objects out there spinning at like a certain
Uh-huh.
rate, clocking everything, keeping a certain time. Yeah, right? Like could it all be like that?
Dude, yeah. I mean, I've been involved in a whole bunch of sci-fi stuff recently. There's like the
I've been
Expanse
reading a
series
ton
that
of
I'm
sci-fi
reading
books. Yeah, that's the other
and
problem.
watching. And also what else is it? 2001 Space Odyssey. And man, it's just messing with my brain because I'm having all these moments throughout the day where I'm like, wait, what is real? Hang on, was this real?
Yeah.
Did I read this? Did I watch this? Was this actual reality? What's going on?
I know. I've been on a kick. I've read probably like 60 sci-fi books in the past like year or so. Like
Oh
I've just
my
been reading.
gosh.
I've been really on a kick recently. And yeah, it does start to mess with you. But like, and it's also the funny fact that like like I was when I was reading that article too, I was thinking that it's like they were saying like this quasar was like uh for like some 100 trillion miles away, right? Like we also know so little about the universe. It's so far. And like, yeah,
Hmm.
like we figure things out, but it's every time we get a new instrument like James Webb, we instantly have to rewrite things because we find out that a lot of stuff we thought we knew we didn't know. And it's interesting that like we know so little about it too. We know so little
Yeah,
about the microscopic world too. Forget about you know, the
yeah,
macro picture. It's interesting.
true. Our concept of distance is skewed. Like so many people, I mean,
Yeah.
so many people have never even left their hometown or their home state or like traveled to another country because you have to get a passport. And it's
Yeah.
like compared with, I don't know, space travel, that stuff is infinitesimally small.
Well, dude, I mean, just like I encourage anyone to look up, you know, to think about how the fact that light takes 8 minutes from the sun to reach the planet, and then look up the speed of light, and
Mm-hmm.
just the distance of the sun to here is insane. Like it's crazy how
Or
far it is.
dude, or a light year because the distances are so vast that they had to create a distance that is the distance that it takes light to travel a year, like
Yeah,
a
yeah,
photon, the time that it takes, the distance it travels in a whole year. That's a
yeah,
light year, and the distances are so vast they've had to measure in light years.
yeah. And yeah, that's funny too, because it's like almost deceiving when they say like it's like, oh, that's like 100 light years away. It's like, yeah, that's really far, like super far, dude. Like, yeah. But I
I
think
mean,
that's the other. Oh, go ahead, wait.
basically, that would be like the sun from before your grandparents were alive. Like a particle from the sun from before your grandparents were
Yeah,
alive has been traveling all that distance, and that's where it is now.
yeah, yeah. It's so weird. Oh, I mean, just and like that's the other thing. Like, I think like the more we know, the less we know. Like, or the more confounding it gets and confusing and just like amazing in a way. And I think it's so easy to get like, and I think that's the funny thing with free will, right? It's so easy to get like concerned about our own little world as if that's the most important thing, forgetting about all this other stuff. And then when you think about it in perspective, it's like, well, do we really have it? All these other things are going on, all these other processes. I mean, why would we have free will? Really, that's the other question. Like, why? You know? And yeah, I mean, why do we even need it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And whenever we talk about this stuff like galactic dynamics and whatever, that was kind of the reason I got into physics because that was stuff was like super cool. But man, learning physics was definitely not that fun.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. It's funny. Like, I love reading about that stuff. And I love reading books on like quantum physics and on like astronomy and stuff. But yeah, like, I don't know. It's just the other part of it that the science part does not
Doing
necessarily
the
interest me
math.
as much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like hearing
Hmm.
about it, learning about
Yep.
it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
wonder
So
with
I think
free
we
will,
answered that one, huh?
I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
Do we
I
have
would,
free
I
will?
would lean, I guess in a final analysis, I would lean probably on like that it's a mechanism for us to function in the world, like an idea that we have, not necessarily real. And I would lean
Mhm.
more in favor of like some kind of either fatalism or determinism is probably actually true.
It probably makes us think that we're gods, you know? Like it gives us that
Yeah.
sense of superiority
Yeah.
because and importance because if we didn't, then we wouldn't be important. But all of a sudden we have free will, so we're important. We're gods, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's funny too, 'cause it's like one thing to say like, well, I chose to do this, and I accomplished this thing, rather than saying like, well, circumstances were like this, these things happened, and all these factors that contributed to it that probably, diminished from my feeling
Mm-hmm.
of that, yeah, of that control and power. Yeah. So there it is, right? Do
Mm-hmm.
we have free will? I think we answered the question for you guys, so now you don't have to stress about that anymore, or maybe this makes it worse. I don't know. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
check us out later this week. We'll be back with another episode. This is the Existential Stoic Podcast. Listen wherever you get podcasts. Watch on YouTube. Please like, share, subscribe. Until next time, though, later.
Later, Danny.